H-159. We were just about to vote it. We ran into a last minute concern about the bill in terms of size of grants and limitations. And many of us have been busy over the weekend trying to sort this out. And so that's what we're trying to figure out now. So, Commissioner, you're pretty much in charge of the capital improvement grants proposal. And can you tell us where that program is at right now in terms of, we left here in May, has any money been issued yet?
No money has been issued yet. First, Joan Goldstein, Commissioner of Economic Development. Good morning, Senators. No money has been issued just yet. We are still in the midst of it. We still have quite a lot of runway to go. We got the preliminary net fiscal impact numbers. We went out to applicants to see if they're still interested. The next step is to get some documentary evidence of COVID impact so that we could make sure that all of the people that we've chosen are aligned with the final ARPA rule. That is in process. We are busily doing that as I speak, actually. So once that happens, then we're going to go through a grant agreement process. And even after the grant agreement process is complete, the feeling is that this would be a grant where they have to requisition funds. It's not going to be where checks are written and then they have to do something. It's really about where are they in the project? What's the scope of the work? What will they be using the state funds for? And then we would need to see presentment of documentation before anything gets dispersed. So there's a lot of runway. There are some people who responded that they're still interested, even though it's a possibly smaller amount. And there's actually one, unfortunately, a daycare center said, no, they will not be able to kick off this project with a small amount of funding. So, mixed bag, but, it is what it is. And this is what has happened as a result of flying the plane while we're designing it. So, but that's the status on capital investment.
Thanks, Joan. Yes, frustrating. I guess my question is an obvious one, which is with organizations that are disappointed by the impact of the size of the grant as a result of the criteria, which we are now changing. Are we making it possible for them to reapply?
There is nothing precluding them from reapplying. I think in last year's language, I think it expressly stated that in Act 74 that if they didn't have enough, they could reapply for future rounds. So I think that is contemplated.
Okay, good.
So is there any way we can see examples of what the applications were? Are these public documents?
Well, so there's a couple of things at play here. One, the files are incomplete. I know the state auditor's office has been in daily asking for that very same thing, but the application is not complete. So it's hard to give people access to incomplete files. That would be really unusual and not advisable. The other thing is that what is public after we make our final determinations and everything's in order. I think what's public is the name of the applicant, I think the type of project and the dollar amount. I don't think people are going to have the ability to view applications that have financial information. We would have to check and see what is publicly available, but generally that's not the case with grants. We typically do the grant award amount, the applicant, and the use.
So the original proposal from the governor was for transformational regional programs, and he had asked for $90 million for that over 3 years, and we cut it last year to $10 million to view this. Let's wait and see what happens with this first $10 million, and it's really hard without able to see what's happened to meet the governor's request this year for $80 million more between this and the Grand List program, which is very similar. What kind of assurances can you give us that this money is, going to be used for recovery, and why is a $5 million project, which I understand the way it's written now, why is that too small?
I'll take both of those. So first, the assurance is, well, first of all, it's a complicated system. So we are working as fast as we possibly can. So this is complex. We have net fiscal impact. On top of that, we got an ARPA final rule. The assurance is that we do not want to break federal rule. And we've got protocols in place to assure that we will not do that. So that's the first assurance. The second is, I know that you mentioned transformational, but as you know, the final rule kind of wiped out a lot of that possibility, because this really is a relief program, and it's really meant to those industries and individual entities that suffered harm because of COVID. So it's a very defined kind of subset. And if given another round, we would be able to make that abundantly clear from the onset, which we were unable to do last year with limited information. So wait, that was the first part of your question. The second part of your question was 5 million. I'm not understanding the question about 5 million not being large.
We have a 20% project award to project limitation in the latest draft. So if 1 million is the largest award, then the project cap would be $5 million. So you've seen many projects in your original applications for $5 million or more?
Oh yeah, there are plenty that are even upwards of that. The more construction that you have, the higher the price point, especially post-pandemic. The construction costs have gone up. So that is not unusual. Having said that, there are also very small projects. So there's a mixed bag. Even though that cap is issued in statute, the cap really is the final rule. So the final rule goes into significant detail about how the award has to be related to the amount of the financial harm. So that is why we're getting additional documentary evidence of the financial impact, so that we'd be able to make those determinations. So even though you have 20% in there, I'm not going to say that we're not going to pay attention to that, but really the thing that drives this will be the ARPA rule. And I know David called me yesterday, whatever, and that was my other sort of piece of advice, is that anything in statute, state statute, that either is contrary or extraneous to the ARPA final rule, it sort of probably doesn't make sense to include. But that's my take on it.
I'm a little confused by that. ARPA may have a rule as to how you and how much you grant a program, but there's a project, but there's no saying that the state can't put another filter on that, right?
And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, even though you have a cap of 20%, chances are it could be much less. So it's going to depend on the amount of impact that they had as a result of COVID.
Right. And we talked a lot about this program originally being transformational and looking forward, and we're trying to get beyond looking back. How can you give us some examples of capital projects that are looking forward, but at the same time deal with recovery as the rule requires?
Sure. So let's take the daycare projects as an example. Those are all looking forward. They're either building out existing programs or creating a new one. So that's looking forward, but you do look at the impact to daycare, and you could see that this, was an area that suffered. The other is the projects that were begun before COVID had an estimate of a project cost, and then post-COVID, the pricing and the estimates have gone up considerably. So that's the type of information we're going to require, is like by how much, right? So if it went up 10%, it went up 20%, those are the types of things we're going to need to see. There are other projects like museums or arts venues that have closed for a very long time. I'm sure that when we see those financials, we're going to be able to ascertain that there was harm. So if they want to build out an extension, let's say Paramount as an example, that's going to help them recover. So it is a little different than just the economic recovery assistance that we had in the prior grant rounds, because that was really about, okay, you had revenue loss, let's help you get through the next day. This is, okay, you had impact and now you have plans on how to recover even better, and we will help you do that. And it does not have to be a one-for-one relationship. So we are in talks right now with Guidehouse about how to best do that.
Are you, is there any, I had the fortune or misfortune to be in appropriations last week on the housing bill, and they're concerned with what we're doing here in terms of how much money we're spending in terms of ARPA funds. Do you do any filtering? You mentioned daycare. I know there's a lot of money going into childcare and daycare and other parts of the budget. Is there any like cross connection with other agencies? How projects are, whether they have other sources of funds potentially?
Yeah, so what we did is we did a cross-agency review. So AHS will get a copy of the list of projects that we're proposing. But I also did check in to say that there is no other assistance meant for build out of childcare. It may be childcare subsidies or childcare workers or some other segment of the childcare picture, but nothing. This is about economic development. This is about construction of daycare, expansion of daycare. So it's very different. Even though there is that feeling like, oh, there's so much funds going to childcare, we are sticking to the precept of this is economic development. This is a redevelopment or an expansion of a childcare center.
And every project you're getting applications for is for construction, pretty much?
Not everyone. There are some that are equipment. There are others that are, it's like an energy component to another project. They're all over the lot. They're kind of all different, to be quite honest. Some are expansions, some are new, a brand new build out. So each one is going to take some special consideration on how that particular project was impacted by COVID.
So I know you have to leave, or maybe you don't.
Well, I think Cassie, we're in the same meeting, so she went to that meeting, and I will have to catch up.
All right, so
yeah, I just wanted to remind us that Joan had sent us a number of projects just to give us a flavor. She sent us, I would say, 10 or 12 projects for us to see, and to see. This was when we were having our discussion of the impact of the criteria of the net fiscal impact, and how much reduced that meant that the grant would be. And I can't find it in my file, but you've given us I'll pull it up and we can print it out. That gives us a pretty good range of the and clarity on what these projects are like and how different they are from the funding childcare, for example, is seeking elsewhere.
Right. Yeah, I mean, to give you a sense of what we did after we got all the applications, we were able to say, okay, now that the final rule is out, first let's identify the either industries that are known to have outsized impact, that is hospitality, arts and culture. I think transportation was on that list, although we didn't get any applications from that sector. And then it was about what were the households that were impacted. So that's when we were able to look at the child care centers or somebody like the food bank, so there were a number of ways to filter. And then based on that, that's who we sent over to the economists to do the net fiscal impact, because all the others that came in, we didn't think they would fit the COVID rule. So that was our kind of screening process. Now that we've got preliminary sort of net fiscal impact maximum amount, we're going to go out to people saying, okay, can you still do the project? We are in the midst of receiving those answers, and then we will do further deep dive into what evidence they're bringing to us to show that delta between pre-COVID and post-COVID. or in the case of a construction project, how their estimates changed. So that's the process. And yeah, I know it's not what was kind of envisioned in Act 74, but once the ARPA final rule was clarified, I mean, we had no choice but to follow the ARPA final rule.
Right.
So in terms of the $90 million the governor asked for, and the $80 million this year, which I assume was the successor to after 10 million had been appropriated last year. Is that a number that's based on more like putting together the budget than any specific data you have that we have $80 million in capital needs out there, or?
So I guess I would say last year it was an estimate, and then when we solicited projects, it did come into over, I think we had 126 applications, and I think it was about 90 million in ask. So it didn't seem that far from the realm of possibility. So yeah, I mean, I think at one point it was an estimate. Then, as it turned out, there seemed to be quite a lot of activity or proposed activity to happen. So.
And when you say $126 million in asks, was that for?
It was 126. It was 126 applications with about 90 million in ask. That's how it.
Is it $90 million in asks? Is that for 90 million in awards or the total project cost?
That wasn't total project cost. That was just what they were asking for, because again, we are only funding up to 50% of the project cost. So none of these were 100% of the project cost. So that is just an estimate of what they were coming out to the state. As I said in earlier testimony, it was interesting because we didn't know quite what the appetite would be, and it sounded like, wow, there are a lot of projects planned, which bodes well for recovery. It's just that we couldn't do all of them, and they didn't all fit into final rule.
So of the 90 million that you had in asked, how is that diluted? I don't know what the right word is.
Yeah.
Given the new ARPA rules.
Yeah, we honed it down into like 10.5 million. So that's,
that was because that was all we appropriated. But in eyeballing the requests, are there a lot of those that no longer fit into ARPA because they didn't have COVID related or something, whatever you said?
Yeah, so we didn't delve as deep into the ones where we'd have to make the individual entity choice. So for example, in the filtering that we did it by industry mainly. But there is an option in the ARPA final rule for the individual entity to make that case. But we thought, since we have many in these known industry sectors that are impacted, let's start with those. And when we ran out of funding, there was no ability to go back to those individual entities. I think if we have another round of money, we may be able to do that. And at the onset, we'd be able to tell them exactly what is necessary in order for them to apply. So yeah, I do think that there is demand even with the ARPA rule. The other thing that is happening is I noticed that a lot of hospitality folks didn't necessarily know that this applied to them as a relief source. In talking to a group of them the other day, they were very dismayed over the VITA forgivable loan changes, but in that they mentioned that they wanted to do HVAC, and I was like, that is an expressly stated use for capital investment. So I do think, once again, that we have the final rule in place, that next round would be able to be advertised correctly and give guidance correctly about how people should apply and what they should apply for. So I think in some ways it was oversubscribed, in some ways it's underutilized by the industries that most need it. So I think that another round would bode well.
Sarah Fox.
Yeah, I think the clarity this time around of the ARPA ruling and what the guidelines are, it's all very clear. And my only concern is if some businesses that would have been perfectly suited for this program, will we be able to, obviously you do some outreach, the minute this becomes law, which we hope it will, that you'll be marketing to all these hardest hit sectors. I mean, the entire community, but
Absolutely.
priorities of our hardest hit sectors, I'm confident this time around we'll get the applications we need to, and it will also be oversubscribed and with the right crowd that need it the most.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
And not underutilized is what I was gonna say. Oversubscribed and overutilized would be great.
So one of the challenges we've consistently had is the question of, can we target this money better to programs that are most in need? So are you able, I think it sounds like you're saying you can take the specific sectors and give them priority treatment. You can carve out some money for them, or you can give them first in line status or raise their caps or whatever. You could do that specific to an industry.
Yeah, so what we did is, because some have been identified nationally as impacted industries, so you know that they're impacted just by nature of being part of that industry. So it makes the compliance check sort of a much quicker and easier analysis. So I think it is targeted, and you'll see that in the final list that we end up with, that it is primarily hospitality, arts and culture, childcare. I think there's an elder care. You know, there's a number of things that you'll see. It makes sense that these were the impacted groups. So I think it is targeted. I think that is by the nature of the ARPA final rule. They targeted it to the most severely impacted, or just impacted industries and impacted entities, and then disproportionately impacted, which are the qualified census tract businesses and households.
Right.
So you tried to apply the ARPA rules to this first 10 million, is what you're saying?
We had to. I don't know a way around that. As soon as that came out, that's when our selection process really became, okay, ARPA rule eligible are going to be the ones that we send to the economists, because everything else would be a waste of the economist's time if they're not going to meet ARPA eligibility. So we did that based on the industry selection, and then we got the NFI, and now we're going to see, are they still going to do it? If they are, then we even need further documentation. So as I said, it's a work in progress, and we still have some runway before people actually get money. But I think just the road to here, it tells us that there is demand for this, and we could do this probably better once, because we have the rules now. We could do this, and we could market it in a way where the most impacted industries know that this money is available and know what they could use it for.
One last question. Now we're going to move to the auditor, who I see is here. So does that mean that if somebody has a worthy project and they're not within these prioritized sectors, their application is essentially not considered?
I think for this round, I think that's fair. Yeah, I mean, I think that is the nature of targeting. So if we're going to target for the most impacted sectors, this is the result of that. And when we have a smaller pot of money, it's all we could do. So again, now that we have the rules, and if we had another round, maybe there'd be others that we could analyze on the merits of that individual entity. But what I'm saying is, after we went through the original filtering process and came up with at least 10.5 million of net fiscal impact for those projects, there was no more room. And I would think that is what you'd want us to do, right? Because of the targeting emphasis that you have.
Thank you, John. Stick around. The auditor is here. Let's turn to him.
I may have to bounce out, and then I'll bounce back in. Sorry.
Sounds good. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Auditor. I assume you've been listening in. We're having a discussion about the size of the grants and the amount of funding. We've had some conversations down the hall where there's concern about how much we're spending on these economic development programs, and we need to be balancing all of that out and be sensitive to that. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on what you've heard so far.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. I only was here for the last 10 minutes. I was in 10 or 15. I was in another meeting, but I thought you wanted to hear from me about the VITA program, and I have a couple of quick thoughts on that. But just to follow up the commissioner's comments, this issue of demand keeps coming up and is discussed. And I don't think it's surprising that when the Agency of Commerce lets it be known that there's free money, that people come forward and say, of course we need this money. We can make good use of it. And some of them can. But that's not the same as demand or need. I mean, as we found in the Economic Recovery Grant audit, the administration, using its formula, estimated just for the group that we reviewed, $130 million in demand, in unmet need. When we looked at their NOI, the net operating income, the figure was $14 million. So, you know, you won't know until there's an independent review of the applications and what they propose and the extent to which they fit within rules and all that stuff. So I just find, you know, claims about demand based on people asking for money not the same as demand or need. So that's just that. As for VITA, it's not something that my chief auditor and I have spent a lot of time on, but we did talk yesterday, and Cassie was kind enough to respond to an inquiry we made of her. And I can say up front, I don't have a lot of experience with VITA. Years ago, I did have occasion to work with Cassie's predecessor. I have respect for their shop. They do a good job. I think they're serious people. And I know they would administer the program by the book. But I have a couple questions about it. First of all, I'm uncertain where the evidence is of demand for this as well. Now, obviously, applications to the program will answer the question to some extent. But do we know whether some or all of the folks who hope to take advantage of this program have attempted to seek money from other sources like banks? And if they are sufficiently positioned to have banks determine that they are worthy of a loan and meet their underwriting standards, then maybe the state could get more for the money by either guaranteeing loans made by banks or paying down interest. That way, instead of spending 15 million, I'll just pick a number out of the air, maybe you could spend 2 or 3 and use the rest of the money for something else. I don't know whether that's been discussed or considered, but you know, VITA doesn't have to be the source of all this money. That's what banks are for. The other thing is that the current program design allows applicants to report declines in net operating income over, or as an aggregate of 2 full calendar years. And there is the potential for kind of a second bite at the apple there. If you were an employer who took full advantage of all that was available from the federal and state programs in 2020 and still came up short, you know, maybe you had $1 million in reduced revenue, but you only got 600,000 or 700,000 in awards of one kind or another, then you had a gap. Well, okay, but it's been 15 months since the end of 2020. And if you're still here, chances are you did the best you could, you made adjustments, you're still operating, you're doing okay. I just wonder about whether we want to give a second bite at the apple for a loss that might have occurred 2 years ago. Also, this question of allowing payment of reasonable owner's income is not absurd on its face, but it certainly lends itself to some head scratching to me as to how they will determine what's appropriate and why, frankly. You know, there's an awful lot of people in Vermont, not employers, just people who will never be made whole from the losses they had in 2020 and 21. And there is no program to make them whole. So I'm wondering why it's deemed essential here, but not elsewhere.
Is there, I've been told that this issue has been confronted before in the VEGgie program, owner's compensation, and it's specifically disallowed as a factor in terms of VEGGie's credits or awards. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I believe that's true. It comes into play when they estimate new employment and new payroll. Basically, it's based on payroll, not jobs, and they can't include increases in owner shares. I believe that's the case.
Sure.
Different program, obviously.
Thank you, Doug. The difference in some ways is all of us, anyone who's a senator or representative, is very clear on the continuing need. And it is, it it's that much longer since 2020, since we shut down. I think you're making a grave assumption when you say that if people are still around, they must be doing okay if they're still in business. I do not. I would beg to differ with you. And I appreciate your being the Cerberus guarding the public trust and our public money. And I so appreciate your work on this. But I also have to beg to differ. We have companies and businesses in these harder hit sectors that have not fully, no one expects to be made whole. I don't think there's a business out there, but they have lost a huge amount and they are still not fully back in shape. And so I would disagree. I think that the need is evident in our community. People are still operating on a shoestring. And between the workforce and the lack of working capital, having used everything to keep themselves afloat, I just, I disagree. I think, and that's the plus for me of VITA, is that VITA will take the individual time and with individual attention to assess their actual need and to grant loans accordingly. So I think you should take great comfort in the fact that VITA will be screening these applications, and that I have a lot of trust in VITA. And so I think actually this moving our next phase of economic recovery into VITA's hands gives me confidence that every one of these projects will be well vetted and that real need will be met as soon as possible. As my chair knows, I wish we'd done this in a way in an earlier fast track bill, but I know, having been to the businesses we're talking about, how real the need is, and VITA will assess it and make grants and loans accordingly.
Well, thank you. And just to keep this in mind with regard to the tourism industry, rooms and meals taxes are well above where they were in 2019. So it's not as if this industry is struggling in the way that they might have you believe. I'm just suggesting that claims about demand have been demonstrably exaggerated in the past. I think it should be based on evidence, but I hear you. It's a good question. In any case, this other issue, the technical issue of whether it's appropriate to include losses from 2020 when money has been provided, $3.4 billion have come into the state for these purposes. Now, I know it's VITA's intent to back that out of whatever the applicants present in terms of documentation for loss. But if the company has moved on 15 months later, and it just seems excessive to me, but that's your call.
Right. I would just add that just because a train is moving doesn't mean it's moving up to speed.
Well, if the rooms and meals taxes are bigger than they were in 19, then somebody's doing okay.
I would say, yeah.
So
But it's business by business, it's not.
Yeah, and those businesses may not be applying, Doug. I think, those businesses may not be, but our arts and culture sector, we know, is our restaurants. I mean, they're suffering from two things: workforce shortage, as you know, and a big hit to their finances.
I couldn't agree more. The workforce issue is real, and these kinds of awards won't really help them in the long term. They have to raise wages. There's no other way to get people to come to work. So
They're doing.
Yeah.
anybody have any questions? So David Hall was supposed to be right in chair.
And they just disappeared.
Just as a quick, because I want to touch upon this issue, because I had a long conversation with David Hall about this. I tasked him with talking to Joan and Cassie to understand how this program would work from beginning to end. And it does seem to me that absent the caps that are in this bill, people who fall below the caps will be made whole dollar for dollar for every loss they've experienced through the entire pandemic, and only subject to the cap with some people not being made whole. And that's the way I think David understands it, and I would love to have him explain that to me after his conversations with, at least on the VITA program. Do you have any information, Mr. Auditor, on how Vermont has done in this area in helping businesses through this process of COVID with all these discretionary funds we've gotten from the federal government?
Yeah, I did take a look after Senator Brock asked the question. I took a quick look, and it was NCSL had some data that was available. It's a little out of date. It's 3 or 4 months behind, as is often the case with this stuff. It appeared to me that Vermont's, what you guys are considering is a bit unusual, that no other states that I could see were devoting this magnitude of resources or for these purposes, not for capital costs. And, you know, you might see that as a plus. But that's all I found. I haven't done any more than that.
Right. And I think just because Vermont's doing something different doesn't condemn a program.
I didn't say that I was
I
condemning
know,
them.
I just want to make sure we didn't, you know, no one else was doing remote worker either. I just want to say that we had a very eloquent email from one of my constituents in Rochester, which is happily still in the Winter District. And you know, she's reporting over these last several years, over $300,000 in losses. Well, she's an agro-tourism business. It's hard to, you know, to do a lot of that, to go or to anything else. You know, these are real losses. She doesn't expect to be made whole, but it would be help to fill some of the holes that she has and refill some holes she had to dig in order to survive. So I don't think even if we get a cap of 250, which I would, you know, I is 50% of what the administration had asked for. So I mean, it's not what the administration asked for. That, you know, that even if she was able to get that through Vida's to say, oh, you know, it still doesn't make anybody whole. So I just want to make sure. I just don't see this making people whole.
I said absent the cap.
Right.
I
Right.
said if people
yes,
don't
without
work against the cap, the goal, the way the formula works out, is people are to get back every loss of dollar in profit that they had. And we can have David explain that.
David is back.
Right. Okay, David, could you join us? I know your time is.
No, my time is yours. You get your morning today. Trying to be where I can when I can. Here I am. So, hi.
Hi. So as I said, I asked David to talk over the weekend with Cassie and Joan and be able to present to us how these programs are designed to work. Because one of the things that I've learned over the period of time is that I don't know who came up with the proposal as it's drafted in the legislation. I don't know if it was Cassie or it was Joan, but whether it's the cap or net operating income or expenses, all of those terms are sort of not well defined. For instance, there is a provision that was supposed to be in the bill, according to Cassie. Now, I don't know if it was supposed to be in the bill, but that's the way she said she was going to implement the program, was that you had to suffer a 25% loss over 2 years. It never said that in the bill. So we were learning those kinds of things that I think absolutely need to be put in the bill. We can't just say that anybody who has a 1% loss and has marginal harm is also going to go through the whole process. And that's what Cassie says she is going to do, but it's not necessarily in law. So David, let's talk about the VITA program first and what you learned about how this would function and what perhaps needs to be specified in the bill to make sure it functions that way.
Yeah, David Hall, Legislative Counsel. So at the risk of playing the game of telephone from other people's words through me to you, I can talk to you about what I understand of how these programs work, and you can tell me what changes you think needs to be made in legislation. If the question is, what are the components from what you've been presented that are not reflected necessarily in the draft languages it currently stands in H-159, then certainly the 25% minimum, law reduction of net operating income is one of those. And I think that is a program element. My understanding is they're proposed to ensure that it's a meaningful COVID-related loss that a business has experienced rather than, just a bad year or a year-over-year sort of, manifestation that may fluctuate. If you looked at the examples that Cassie has provided you of how this would work, I think it's a fairly straightforward process that is, like with a lot of programs that come into legislation, there are varying levels of details that get reduced down to, step-by-step processes versus more general frameworks where the details are fleshed out. I'll take as an example the veggie program. There was a holistic rewrite of that language several years ago, and that is very much it tries to be a literal step-by-step statutory framework of how every single thing happens. And even though there are a lot of documents and guidance adopted by BEPC that help implement that statute, it's a very detailed statute relative to what we normally see for programs. I'd say the CIP program and the ERG program, maybe the next step over, pretty detailed for a statute with the way you guys crafted them and passed them these past couple of years. And then of course that runs the gamut all the way to programs that are just one item, one line in the budget. It says $10 million to the HCV to create affordable housing. So it definitely spans the whole gamut, and how much specificity you want in the statute is up to you. I'd say the general framework for the VEDA program is that we're going to have a base value of both revenue and of expenses for a base year. Normally that would just be all of 2019, but it's going to depend on when the business was in operation, what it looked like. And part of the underwriting process is to decide what a reasonable and legitimate baseline is. So if there are things that are extraordinary in a given year, or if there's seasonality to contend with, if there's an odd time frame, it is possible that you won't just use plain old 2019. VEDA may want to adjust what they use as the baseline. But that's not specified in your language. That's just sort of an understanding of how their program would function. So once we've established this baseline for what revenue was and what expenses were in a typical year, in its simplest form, it would be baseline 2019 versus 20 and 21. And my understanding from the examples is that the 20 and 21 combined give you the total of what your net adjusted operating income is. So how did your total revenues look against your total expenses? Did you have losses in 20 and 21? What was the value? Note, they do, and the statute says this sort of generally, it says they will account for, they will back out non-cash expenses, so things like depreciation, amortization, other things you don't actually have to outlay cash for, but come out of what is considered to be your expenses. That would come out. They would also take out extraordinary items. The example Cassie cited to me was, for instance, if there was a big fire that damaged a lot of your property, you had to pay to rebuild something. That's not going to happen every year. So they would use their flexibility in the underwriting process to figure out things like that that need to come out of what your expenses are. And then we just compare. We say, here's what, if 19 was this and 20 plus 21 were that, did you suffer over those 2 years as compared to your baseline, a 25% or greater reduction in your operating income? That's a meaningful loss. She said it's not a magic number. It could be lower, could be higher, but that's a reasonable baseline, we think, for what a COVID-related down pair of years would look like. At that point, it's really the loss that has been experienced in 20 and 21 that plugs in to what your loan amount is. And that loan amount, as your bill is put together, and as I understand they would operate the program, would always be the lowest value of three things. The first thing being the amount of that reduction or loss in 20 and 21. Or X months of Y costs, and I'm going to fill in those variables in a moment, or an absolute program cap, whether that's 150, 250, 300. You're always going to get the lowest value of those three things. So if 20 and 21 came out to be $300,000 of reduction in your net operating income, that's one value. Then you're going to have 3 months or 6 months of either what we consider operating expenses or fixed costs, depends on what you guys choose. That would be the second option. And the third option would be a dollar value limit on everybody across the board.
Can I just interrupt for 1 second? Because I want to just understand, and I think while it's fresh in people's mind. Could it have been the decision, and maybe Cassie can answer this as well. Now, and this goes to, I think what Doug Poplar said, could it have been the loss in income that the business suffered compared to 2019 that they're presently suffering? So we're going to bring them up in this year to their income levels of pre-pandemic, as opposed to filling 2 years of losses and pay them back for every dollar they've lost. Just that 1 year to bring them up to the level of earnings that they had in 2019.
You could do it that way. You could just,
Cassie, do you have any rationale why you chose 2 years of losses versus, the higher of those 2 years or something like that? Of 1 year of losses? I mean, I would think that people would be very grateful to get back on their feet at the same level of income as they were in 2019.
Sure, I can attempt to address that. Cassie Polimas, Vermont Economic Development Authority. Thank you, David. That was a great recap. I appreciate it because it's not easy. It is a bit more involved than just setting up, strict formulas that you got to fit into the box. And that was really the one of the primary reasons of going this direction of bringing VITA in was to provide that flexibility. But to the point of the question, the thought process in this is to look over the broader time span of what we know now as, COVID, the COVID years of 2020 and 2021, look at the experience of the businesses, the losses, but also incorporate all the other COVID subsidies that they've received during that time frame, which some were in 2020, a lot were in 2020, some were also a little bit more in 2021. And that other subsidy gets included into the calculations so that we have the full picture of what they've already received, and then calculate what is still that hole. And then that hole is meant to be help for going forward. And so hence the calculation, or the calculation of lesser of that whole 6 months of operating expenses during a normal year, or the maximum amount available. And that money would then be forward looking to go into the future here and keep the businesses operating, provide that additional working capital that they still need. So, we know a lot of businesses are doing okay, but the ones that are not are the ones that are the hardest to figure out how what was wrong with the other programs. And it's a variety of things that, they may have fallen through the the gaps on. Maybe it was when they were incorporated, maybe it was how many people were employed at the time. It's a whole variety of things, but there are those businesses that, and we know them, they're the ones that are in the service sector, the ones that had to be shut down for longer than other businesses that relied on in-person services. And those are the ones that still are suffering.
Question.
Thank you. Cassie, thank you, and I'm very grateful that you and David had that time, and I know you've also done. So could you just talk to us, I mean, I get the 2020, the combination of 20 and 21 gives you a fuller picture of both the loss and what they have received in COVID help. Would you be kind enough to clarify why 6 months for you is a big improvement in terms of being able to analyze the need of these businesses versus the 3 months? Because that's sort of one of our sticking points, and I'd really love to have you illuminate for us why 6 months is better from your point of view.
Most of these businesses were closed for longer than 6 months. So 6 months is going to provide a much more meaningful impact. And again, if 6 months operating expenses is greater than that NOI decrease, they won't get the full 6 months. If they can qualify to get the full 6 months, then they need the full 6 months. They were closed for longer than 6 months. So it's, the cases where they did not get enough other COVID relief to make up for the amount of time they were closed.
But you'll analyze each of those individually and determine what the is.
Yep.
The three choices are limitations on the amount of the grant.
Right.
Getting in the door is 25%.
Right.
Loss.
Right. Which
And I just want to point out that 25% is a really high hurdle when you're looking at NOI. I mean, we could do this program and do it well and still have all these guardrails and not have that 25% there.
It seems to me, in my simple mind, that if you look at 25% total loss over 2 years, you can accomplish that by 12.5% per year, and that equals 25% if you're looking at 2 years. I'm not sure I agree that that's a real super hurdle compared to where I've heard people claiming their losses being the people who've been really hard hit. To lose 12% of your income, I don't think is not what I was thinking of the real hardship cases we've been talking about.
Well, there's a different, I understand the question or the comment. I just want to point out that there is a drastic difference between a drop in revenues of 12% and a drop in net operating income of 12%.
Which is what she's at.
I agree. And I have a question for you, Joan, as well.
Yeah, I just, if I may, I just want to add to that a little bit. Remember that the ARPA final rule prevents us from giving assistance to more than what the impact was. So there's a built-in sort of guardrail there as well. Right after the discussion on Thursday, I did hear from hospitality businesses stating how NOI would not work for them. And so they had a very simplistic suggestion, which I think might help, which is they had to have a reduction in revenue from pre-COVID to post-COVID, and that we pay up to 6 months of expenses up to the amount of that loss after taking into consideration all the prior aid. And so I looked at our ERG grants, and there were about 7 applicants who reached the threshold of 150. And when I looked at what their adjusted net loss was, and just to refresh everyone's memory, the adjusted net loss took into consideration all the prior assistance. And we're talking about millions of dollars in losses. These were event companies, distilleries, accommodation and food services, and one agriculture. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of losses, and they got 150,000. So I just want to frame that yes, there are still losses out there. Yes, we know rooms and meals are up, but there are individuals that are still suffering the pains of not being able to have full attendance and full occupancy. And this money is meant to help those businesses. So I just want to say the original input that we had to devise this VITA loan plan is so that VITA can do that assessment of need. And we have the ARPA final rule to keep us within that guideline. So I'm hoping we're not going to repeat the same issue we had last year where we had a formula that didn't work for folks. I don't want to say that's too bad for those individual businesses that are imploring us to take another look at this.
Well, I, for one, don't want to get into the same trap as last time. For instance, the example I always give is you came to us with a limit of 3 months of fixed costs and you listed those costs. And one of the objections was, well, we have 8 different other kinds of fixed costs. So I don't think that's the kind of stuff we can deal with in this committee. But I do think it's good to have a second set of eyes. So when you adopt those guidelines, even though it's in your discretion, what you do, you at least talk to the Joint Fiscal Office and the Joint Fiscal Committee. So people who have more experience and more time and more detail can work together to come up with the program details. And obviously Cassie would be front and center in explaining why one expense may be included or another, or whether you have some general language for exceptions. But I guess
I think we ended up at 3 months, but I think the administration started at 6 months.
Okay, I could be wrong. So let me ask you a question. What is I think the $150,000 cap was a suggestion. We started this program as just a gap filling program. Now we're going way beyond that, and we're suggesting $500,000.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we
suggesting $500,000, it would seem the program would be smaller rather than bigger as a result of us not finding that there were many people in the gap.
Well, it's smaller in totality, right? It's 20 million, not hundreds of millions, right?
Oh.
That's one thing. And also, I look at this as our last chance to kind of get this right, that, not to leave people out. And the whole idea with VITA being able to assess that is there are individual cases out there that one formula is not going to meet. Remember the beginning of the session, you kept asking me for a formula and I wouldn't give it. Like, that's the thing. And I feel like we're back in that same mode where we're trying to figure out the perfect formula. And maybe that's extraneous thinking and working when we already have rules in place, that put limits.
I don't think that in this context, we're talking about formulas anymore. I think we're talking about, for the purposes of this bill, we need to know what the threshold is to get into the program and what the caps are. And then we also perhaps may open up how much money we want to put in the program, because that may impact that as well. So those are the things we're talking about. I think they're totally within the legislature's prerogative to say that. I mean, we could have an open-ended program and, you could find somebody who, without a cap, you could find somebody who needs a $10 million thing to get back to their level of things. And it could be a giant grant to one big business, and all our small businesses would hurt as a result of that.
But that's not going to happen given what we put.
I'm just answering our question, saying, that we don't want to put parameters.
Fine.
Okay, so let's see who else we can hear from. David, were you finished?
Sure.
In terms of, you didn't talk about the.
While we're on the caps, may I just ask a
Okay.
question? So while we're on the caps, I just am curious. We have a 150 cap here, which mirrors the economic recovery grants, which we think means we will be able to help more more organizations, more businesses. But I guess before we, and I'm hoping we're thinking about the 250, just because my understanding is that there are going to be probably very few companies that hit or go above 150 and or between that 150 to 250. Do you have just a vague notion of how many you think would hit that 250 cap? Cassie, I remember you saying you didn't think it was very many, like Cassie or Joan, or one of you.
Yeah. I think most of them will be under, but I would hate to not be able to accommodate the few that need more than that, because those businesses are the ones that didn't receive enough money in a disproportionate level. They did not receive enough money. They fell through a lot of the cracks in prior programs. So, but is that going to eat up the 20 million? No. If we had a $500,000 cap, that's not going to eat up the 20 million. It's going to help a few of these impactful businesses that did suffer a lot and are still suffering a lot. I would strongly recommend not worrying about that being like where the money's going to go, because that's not going to happen. There are so many guardrails already.
Right.
What's a bigger risk is that we end up not being able to help them.
What are the so many guardrails that you see?
Well, we can't give them more than their total amount that they've lost. So, and that's including all the other relief that they've had. And we will do our due diligence on that. We will know what they've also already received.
Are you suggesting, Cassie, that we give them more than they lost?
No, I just said we won't.
That's a
Oh, she's just
No.
saying that's a guardrail.
No, I know, but she said that's a guardrail that she said sounded to me like she was saying that's already a problem because we're not.
No, she's saying that's a guardrail we're living under. You can't just, and all the ARPA guardrails, but the guardrail she's saying the biggest one is there's the 25% hurdle to get in, and then there is the guardrail if you cannot give more than what they've actually lost. Right? Is that the guardrail you were talking about?
Yes, that's definitely a very strong guardrail.
And what
And the other ones are, the other ones are there because they won't even get that. If the decrease in the NOI is greater than 6 months worth of expenses or whatever the cap ends up being, they're not even going to get there.
So 6 months worth of expenses in your vision includes not just fixed expenses, includes all expenses, right?
Yes, that's the ARPA. The ARPA language is operating expenses. So to distinguish between fixed and variable, I think causes confusion. And what's in the draft right now is fixed and operating is kind of redundant. So I think, my recommendation is just leave it at operating expenses. That's what's in ARPA. That will include fixed and variable. And I don't know if we're done with this particular question, but I do want to make sure I get one other comment in before we move on to something else off the loan program.
He said go for it.
Go for it.
Oh, go for it. Okay, thank you.
Go for it.
I've been learning more about ARPA since I got pulled into this project. And one of the things that I've learned is that ARPA is available as a potential relief for businesses that started either just before the pandemic or during the pandemic. And we know that there are businesses in that category that have suffered because of the pandemic. There are rules that have to be adhered to, but I'm pointing this out because right now in the draft, one of the eligibility criteria is that the business had to be in operation on or before January 27th of 2020. And that was based on when somebody defined that the pandemic started. but it doesn't mean that they're not eligible under ARPA for CRF relief. So my recommendation is to also take that threshold out so that those businesses, and again, there aren't a lot of them, but to not be able to help them would be a miss once again. And ARPA does include clear language on what needs to be met, what the criteria is, how you document things such as, you know, you didn't have access to capital because of the pandemic, or increased costs because of the pandemic. So there's others as well. So I just wanted to put that on the table because I think that's important too.
The 250. Is that what you just said? Sorry. I
No, the
missed
date, the
Right.
date.
the day.
Is that in our bill right now?
I believe it's in the forgivable loan program portion of the bill. Yeah, it's on page 15, second line.
Page 15, eligible with fewer than 500 employees, yeah, in operation on January 27th, 2020.
And the suggestion is to have different date or no date?
No date.
Yeah.
It's not necessary.
Okay. It's fine by me.
I guess I just want to understand this. So somebody who started in 2021 is not eligible for any of this money? Is that the way it reads now?
That's the way it reads now, yes.
I wonder if that's a vestige from last year's law.
David,
Is that from the previous program?
You've had similar constructs in previous programs, yes.
So I guess I just want to go back to Joan and just ask again why the program is being expanded from what was proposed last year in terms of the cap.
I think we want to learn the lessons of last year, right? So last year, the cap was 150, 3 months of fixed, and obviously you needed the tax loss. I think the way it looked on Thursday is that the only thing changed was the tax loss as a requirement. So people who need to meet these thresholds want to do it if there is some return, and people who had millions of dollars of losses, 3 months is really not going to help them. The group that we met with last week said that all in all, they were impacted with 8 months worth of combination of closure versus limited occupancy and all the rest of it. So that's why we're thinking about 6 months. It's less of an expansion and more of a, let's do this so that we could help as many as possible. We know that the small threshold, the lower number of ceiling is hard for these businesses that had more significant losses. So if we have the ability and we have the funding, let's do it. I don't see us doing this each and every year. So let's do it so that we're able to help them. As we know, we've got 26 million leftover funding from that ERG. Let's not do the same thing with this. So that's the reason for increasing the cap and increasing it to 6 months.
I know we can't see exactly what's going on with the CIG at this point, but can we see the applications that you gave out $4 million to, and which people have bumped up against the cap? Or is that what you're saying?
that these are, I just handed out, Joan, the examples
This is capital investment.
that you had sent out on the capital investment. Just the ones a couple weeks ago that you had shared that were being impacted by the net fiscal impact from challenge, and so how much smaller the grants were going to be as a result. But it does give you a good idea. It gives the committee a good idea of some of the groups requesting, some of the businesses requesting the capital investment grants.
I remember seeing a report on the ERG thing, but it was pretty sketchy. I don't know if that's the right word, but do you have more detail in terms of what kind of businesses apply for that money.
Please don't say on the record it was sketchy. I mean, I think we worked really
I
hard on that
said,
report.
Check myself.
All right,
Look, I'm just wanting to know on the experience what we've seen, you know, people
Yeah.
bumping against the cap and, because
Yeah.
quite honestly, this bill as it moved forward, we were focused on your concerns about return on investment and the process and all this stuff. We never heard concerns about the cap or the fixed costs or that as being a problem for people applying. We
Well, up
focused
until
on
last
the
Thursday,
applications very-
yeah, I thought up until last Thursday, it was 6 months of operating, and then all of a sudden it changed to 3 months of fixed, and it went from 250, which I think we thought was a compromise, down to 150. So to be fair, Chairman, you know, it was a surprise on Thursday that this had been changed so drastically without having testimony.
That's why we're having testimony now.
Right.
Because
Right. So,
that's a fair criticism, but the bill, you know, as I said before, the bill in its place was never discussed or agreed upon. It was just sort of a kitchen sink kind of thing. And when you came to us, you said the problems were return on investment. We got rid of that. We said the problem was administrative difficulty. The existing program had never been criticized on the cap, or
Right.
and maybe it's just because you thought you had it in the bill.
Right. And I think in all fairness, that was a compromise from the 500,000 they asked for. So I think they thought by including it in the bill that that was a compromise that we'd already agreed to. And we spent a lot of time on the criteria, and I think we're all okay with the criteria at the moment. I think that it is you know, we're down to the 6 months and the cap size. So it had, you're right, it had been there for a while, and Michael, in all fairness, had said, this is a draft, but we didn't spend as much time talking about the caps in the 6 months as we spent on the
Never heard
criteria.
that was a problem.
no, we didn't, because there's so much else wrong with it. So we focused on the most important things first. But in our testimony, and I believe in a report, we did talk about the reasons why people were not applying and continuing with their application. One was, of course, the loss, but others said it took so long to do the application and to get 3 months of fixed when, you know, with 150 cap, when they've got millions in losses, just does not have an ROI for them. And I understand that, right? They were in the midst of reopening. They didn't have labor, and this was just a nightmare for them. To answer your question more directly, can we give you the list of those who met up against the cap? I think we could. I will find out what we'd have to blot out, but these are people that I mentioned before. There's farms, there's hospitality, there's distillery and manufacturer that had over 1 million, in some cases, multiple million of losses, and they got $150,000. So I think it will be used if we do a higher cap. It will not wipe out all of the funding. That is our thought process.
In all fairness, I think that's part of our concern, is wanting to help as many businesses as possible. And so that I think that you're thinking that we won't hit this cap is interesting, even if we go up to 250. I mean, even if we go up to 250, that we won't use all the 20 million.
I don't know. It's all going to depend on how people's net operating income ended up. As Cassie had mentioned, that 25% is a hurdle. So again, I think the state is being much more strict than the federal rules, and you have every right to do that. I totally understand that. However, there are people out there that are hurting, and we're just trying to help them.
Right. And we're all trying to do the same thing. I guess I would remind us all, we are all trying to do the same thing. We're trying to help our business community and our workers. This bill covers both and balances the need for workers who had to take time off and the need of businesses that want to thrive into the future. And we have opportunities both to help them survive and help them thrive. So I think that we have 3 important parts to this bill.
So one last question. You said that, and I wasn't aware of this, that you basically in practice have limited the grants to the sectors that are most hurting. Is that true for both programs or just for one program?
We kept it.
So on the ERG, as we know, it was whoever qualified. So we didn't have to target necessarily because there was such a small subset that was eligible, right? On the capital investment, yes, we did have to do this very targeted because of the final rule. And that's how we made determinations on preliminary finalists. I don't know if I answered your question, but I mean, we've been through this for like 2 years now, right? We know that we know that people who serve hospitality are going to be impacted. It's not really that hard to pinpoint who is still suffering.
Well, and I would just remind us that our restaurants, a lot of them applied to the national program that was specifically designed for restaurants, and most of our local Vermont restaurants did not get help because it ran out of money.
Yeah.
And they had a priority system that served, a whole population, a socioeconomic population that had higher needs, but nonetheless, our restaurants never got help. A lot of them.
And the event companies and the lodging properties didn't have opportunities for the restaurant revitalization. So, if we want to be fair, we want to be equitable, I think if this is our effort to just have a program that can impact, we'll do the right thing.
Thanks very much. A lot of information to digest. Stay tuned.
Thank you.